Oh, what the hell? Let's start now. Folks are here. Okay, so I assume that we are good. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Jim Salzman. I am an environmental law professor with a joint appointment at the Bren School of the Environment at UC Santa Barbara and the law school at UCLA, and a member of the Emmett Institute on climate change and the environment. Today's conversation is co-hosted by the Emmett Institute. It is UCLA's Environmental and Climate Change Center. Emmett Institute conducts scholarship, represents clients in its clinic from local environmental justice issues to national climate policy. It's got 10 full-time faculty members, and we launch careers of our students. It's also co-hosted by Libros Schmibros. So what is Libros Schmibros, you might add? So let me introduce David Kipen, who's part of that. David is in some respects kind of Mr. LA. He wrote a book. Actually, I got a thing that says "Can't Hear You," so I need to make sure if I can get some kind of confirmation from someone who is. All right, that's the only one I got. So I'm assuming that's the problem with that person's computer, not ours. So David is the author of a book called "Dear Los Angeles: The City in Diaries and Letters." David, can you show everyone your book?
He's making me do it.
The reason we do this is to move the merch. There we go. Thank you. So he's also the co-founder of Libros Schmibros, which is a bilingual nonprofit store lending library. Their goal is to put books in the hands of our neighbors. He teaches writing at UCLA, and most important, he and I were college classmates long ago. And lastly, I want to introduce my fabulous co-author, Michael Heller. He is a chaired professor at Columbia University and one of the world's experts on property law. So that's it. That's who we are. And David, take it away.
Sure thing. First of all, well, thank you to everybody who's listening in, and congratulations to the two of you. I want to thank both of you or blame both of you because you've basically colonized my brain. The book, which if I'm going to hold up mine, I should hold up yours, mine, How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives. And the book is actually controlling my life because everywhere I look, I see the thesis of the book, which I'm not going to paraphrase because, well, why don't you guys do it? What would you say is the thesis of the book? You may as well get in fighting trim because people are going to be asking you right and left, especially since a lovely write-up yesterday by Elizabeth Colbert in the New Yorker.
So I'll jump in. Michael can jump in as well. So there are a bunch of ways to frame it. The way I like to think of it is basically this shows that we try to show how ownership really controls our lives. You know, hundreds of times every day, we are dealing with the hidden rules of ownership. It's where you stand at the front of the line, the back of the line. It's where you drive, where you live, the medications that you take. And we don't think about all these decisions that we make every day as ownership, but they really are. And the thesis, if you really want to sort of distill it down, is that we actually we think of ownership too little and we think of it too much. We think of it too little because we don't recognize just how much these rules shape our lives. We think of it too much because we rely too much on law to think about how ownership should play out, when in fact, law really is a small part. Michael, how would you go at it?
Well, I would say exactly that. Law is overrated. That's one of the hardest messages we have to get across to our students. People, and actually people out in the world, they think that law really matters. 99.99% of the time, law is irrelevant to how you get through your daily life. And people feel like, oh my God, ownership, law, it's something that's, you know, I can't really handle. It's too big, it's too remote, I don't understand it. But you understand like what it means to line up at Starbucks and somebody else goes around you and gets their latte ahead of you. You know what it means to line up at Disney World or Disneyland. You know what it means to have neighbors fighting with you over your fence. And in 99 and almost all of those cases, it never comes down to law. You know what happens when you lose a wallet or find one. When we ask our students, how many of you have had engaged with the law about losing something or finding something? Never, not one. In our 5,000 students, has there ever been recourse to law? It's all about the small handful, the 6 simple stories about ownership that Jim and I have identified. There's just 6 simple stories that everybody uses to claim everything in the world. And that is outside of law. It's only tangentially related to law. And these are stories every one of us can master.
I can't wait to tell the dean of the law school how law is irrelevant. You mentioned the examples, and the book is full of wonderful examples. I mean, the One Thinks of Freakonomics is another terrific book that does a similar thing, which is, come at us with wonderful, unexpected, delightful examples. I mean, I've got a couple of favorites, but I could give you your choice and feel free to order off the menu. The parking space, to pick something at the more trivial end of the spectrum, the parking chair, or at the other end, the one that truly terrifies me, the South Dakota example.
Let me start with the parking chair, and then we can go to Michael for South Dakota. So depending on where folks are from who are watching, in a number of cities, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Chicago, after a snowstorm, if you dig out your chair, then the practice is sometimes called the parking chair, savesies or dibs. You put a chair in, and people respect that. Basically, the spot will be there when you return later that day. Sometimes it's an orange cone, sometimes it's a Fruit Loops box, and that seems to work. If you try to do that in New York City, save your space with a parking chair, not only will you lose the space, you will lose your chair, right? That sort of method of communication is not respected. So what's going on here? Why is this sort of trivial example actually pretty significant? We can't possess everything at the same time, right? We can't sort of put our arms around it. And so a large part of ownership is symbolic possession, right? The same thing with putting a jacket on the back of a seat, right? You can't control the seat yourself. You can't put your arms around it, but you put a symbol there. And the question is, are people going to respect that symbol or not? And what's fascinating is that in some cities, like in Boston, with gentrification, essentially what's happened is there are battles now breaking out over folks who park in these spaces and take them, because the shared customs that have been so much the part of the neighborhood, they're breaking down because people are coming in who either don't know them or don't respect them.
So if you think about the phrase like possession is 9/10 of the law, right? That's so deep. It's actually one of the oldest legal principles. It goes back at least to the Code of Hammurabi from 4,000 years ago. But it actually goes way deeper. It goes deep into our evolutionary history. And that's what, the earlier animal version of that is animal territoriality, animals marking territory, marking possession of this area. When you hear birds singing, what they're always chirping about is, back off, this stuff is mine. It's actually a very, it's about defending their possession of their territory. So that notion of possession is so deeply rooted. And the parking chair in Boston, that has nothing to do with the law. It's actually against the law. In Boston, if you move the chair and take somebody else's spot, you will not be surprised that someone will key your car or slash your tires or break your window, and the police won't defend you. Like, you didn't respect the chair. So it's not the law, but possession is way more powerful than law. That's, kids know that on the playground, holding on to their thing. It's mine, I'm holding on to it, I possess it. In the supermarket, this. Like, think about like when you have your shopping cart full of stuff, before you've gotten to the checkout counter. Imagine if somebody comes over and reaches into your shopping cart and takes out the milk and then says, oh yeah, eggs, you've got eggs too, I'll take those as well. Can you like imagine that happening? Like, you don't own the stuff in your shopping cart, and yet your claim is based purely on possession. It's mine because I possess it. So this notion of possession is so powerful. It is one of the 6 very simple stories that kids and adults use to claim everything in the world. We love these stories. We love seeing like how it works at like a Fish concert. I don't know if this LA crowd is into Fish concerts, but at Fish, there's a whole ecosystem of saving spaces, of possessing spaces through tarps. And it's a pretty mellow crowd, but the tarp gets too big. And like even Fish fans are like, you can't do that. Like, that's beyond in possession.
Right. So one of the themes of the book is these 6 stories are often in conflict. So let's go back to the parking space. So Michael's talking about possession. The car that moved in there, that's current possession. I've got this now. The person who's angry, right, basically is really saying one of the stories, which is labor. It's mine because I worked for it. I did all the work to dig out the car. I earned this spot. And so what you've got essentially is possession's 9/10 of the law versus you reap what you sow. And one of the points of the book is, importantly, there's no right answer. right? There's no single natural answer to any of these. It's battling stories. And the question is, which story is going to win?
Jim, how long have you lived in Los Angeles, and can you explain to me why we have no parking chair? We are apparently lawless where parking is concerned.
Well, first of all, I live in Santa Barbara, so my friends in Santa Barbara would want to be very, very clear, very clear about that. The second is you don't have the labor claim, right? What are you doing? Digging out palm fronds? They're falling from the trees? I mean, there's no conflicting claims here. Right. What makes it difficult is you've got these different stories, each justifying saying it's mine.
And you mentioned gentrification, which is something I think about from time to time because Libros Schmibros is in Boyle Heights, which, like the neighborhood I think you focus on in the parking chair chapter, is a neighborhood in transition. Libros is called what it's called because it used to be a very Jewish neighborhood when my family lived there, and it's now a very Mexican-American neighborhood. Who owns Boyle Heights?
That's one of the really deep questions is sort of what does it mean to have cultural ownership? And that cultural ownership it can be a tribe, it can be tribal ownership, it can be native ownership, or native ownership of patterns. There's cases of Navajo patterns showing up on whiskey flasks at Urban Outfitters. And the tribe objects and say, of all the crazy things to use our cultural sort of designs to put it on whiskey flasks and is insulting and crazy. But so who owns the symbols of culture? And then who has a claim to the community or in the neighborhood? That is very much a question of one of our 4 stories, which is your home is your castle. It's the attachment story. What is attached to my home? And to what extent can I attach a community around me, a community of interest? So this is this becomes controversial. And it becomes controversial not just for gentrification, but every resource that we care about. The ownership stories conflict when the resource becomes more scarce. Like parking shares weren't controversial in Boston for generations because there wasn't enough parking. It only becomes scarce when they start building triple deckers and condos. Wealthier, whiter people are moving in, and then it becomes two conflicting stories about ownership. And that's happening as well in Los Angeles with claims about gentrification. It's very much a claim of how do we manage these two conflicting stories. California today is actually in one of the most interesting moments. I assume most of our listeners today are in California. One of the most interesting moments in urban policy. This is a little bit of field from our book in terms of thinking about how we're going to create enough space for housing in the next 20 years. That is the biggest economic challenge for California, is basically making available space for people to live who want to live here, rather than driving them away to Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, which is what's beginning to happen. It's actually an area that surprisingly is uniting both progressives and conservatives, and basically saying we should be able to build more, sort of the opposite of a NIMBY movement. The opposite of a not in my backyard, don't build anywhere near me. Let's be able to build.
My plan for keeping people from leaving California for Texas is to make Elon Musk shovel more snow. So I'm curious, I did mention the South Dakota examples. Anybody want to weigh in on that?
So one of them, this may surprise some people here today, and I didn't know this really until I was really digging into this book. One of the things that we've done in America is we actually have created two separate legal systems. This is actually an area where law does matter. And there's one legal system for inheritance and wealth transmission that governs most of us listening today. It's been historically the case that if you make a will, things pass through your will. If you don't, the state decides where they go. And that system, means we have to pay taxes. We sort of comply with our civic responsibilities. A number of states have realized one of the hidden rules of ownership in America, which is that ownership is defined at the state level. There's no federal law of property. Property isn't defined in the Constitution. And that means each state can make its own rules. And what states realized is they could attract money from extraordinarily wealthy people without having the people actually even have to come there. So South Dakota actually took the lead in this. They have created, not metaphorically, actually quite literally, an alternate legal system for the super rich, not for the 1%ers, for the 1% of the 1%. When your assets are in 8 or 9 figures, in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, then you have to think about, how do I shirk any tax obligations? How can I make tax payment voluntary? And the answer is South Dakota. If I don't want to pay my spouse in a divorce proceeding, or my children for custody, or if I injure somebody or defraud my business partners, how do I avoid paying for those responsibilities? And the answer is South Dakota. So South Dakota has created an alternate legal system which has become the world's leading money haven. I don't know how many of you know this, but it is crushing Switzerland and the Cayman Islands as the place now where really rich people go to hide their money. If you're super rich, you already know this because you're using a combination of South Dakota trusts to basically stash your money and avoid responsibility. And the way Jim and I understand what South Dakota has done, it's really quite appalling. What South Dakota has done is create the possibility of an actual American aristocracy, an aristocracy of inherited wealth rather than of noble titles. So it's exactly what the founders were trying to stop 250 years ago. South Dakota on its own has been able to recreate. And they actually even call the trust that they've created, the legal system that they've created, they call these dynasty trusts. Come to South Dakota and you can create your own dynasty, a dynasty based on wealth, where you can create trusts that have perpetual life, in which you can shelter money for generation after generation, enormous amounts of money. At a minimum, $300 billion has flowed into South Dakota in recent years. But the numbers are hard to measure because one of the features of these trusts is that they have basically bulletproof secrecy. Your spouse, even your spouse, can't find out that you've moved your money there in many cases. It possibly is $1 trillion. The state Supreme Court Chief Justice, testifying in front of the legislature last year, said, according to the FDIC, it's over $3 trillion. That number seems a little high to me, but however you measure it, this is basically dwarfing cash flows into many other of the sort of where hot money in the world goes. And it's really creating a very different America from the America that we know. We all know about the sort of pathways of wealth inequality through race discrimination, through educational disparities. But the ability of rich people to keep their wealth, to stay rich generation after generation, that is something that people don't realize. That isn't through the market. It isn't just natural. That sort of perpetual wealth creation requires the most deviant states in America, like South Dakota, to create the possibility to impoverish states like California, New York, Texas, and Florida. Rich people live in nice places. They live in Pasadena and Santa Monica. They live where it's, where the living is good, but their money lives in South Dakota. They never even visit. Not one road gets paved in South Dakota. Not one book gets purchased for a South Dakota school. The money basically lives there to be free from taxes and free from responsibility.
Wow, can we stick Sioux Falls with the bill for the American Recovery Plan?
The amount that's been sheltered there and the taxes that are avoided are on the order of magnitude of the COVID bailout.
God. Do you guys think of this, to what extent do you think of this as a political book?
I think inevitably ownership is political, right? In the sense that, ownership basically is the structure, the framework we use in any society to decide who gets access to scarce resources, right? You don't need ownership rules if there's more than enough to go around. Ownership only matters when you got more people that want something than can get it. And then you've got to decide who gets it and who doesn't. Is it mine? From a book cover, doesn't work with that. Anyway, from virtual backgrounds, the book cover basically is a fork in a slice of pie. Who gets the slice of pie, right? And so you have to make a value judgment over which party you're going to favor. And that's inherently political.
I think this book is, I think that ownership is nothing but political. One of the challenges, especially dealing with lawyers and law students, is people tend to think that there's a natural or a technical or a correct or a legal answer to any question about who gets what and why. And that is never the case. It has never been the case. It is never will be the case. Who gets what and why? Ownership is who gets what and why in our society. And that question couldn't be more political. And part of what's so powerful about the rules of ownership is that people experience them as natural. They experience them as fixed. And the goal of our book, in substantial measure, as I see it, is to make visible that deeply political nature of how ownership actually works. I mean the political there in a very big sense. It's like, it's how we work as parents with our kids. It's how we work as consumers buying things. And it's in the sort of conventional political sense of how we engage as citizens in a democracy where we have, for example, a system like South Dakota, which robs states like California and Texas and the federal government of the revenue. I mean, all of us, every one of us, every person listening today is paying more in taxes and getting less in services because of South Dakota trusts.
And David, if you think about it in terms of the span of human history, and this is a university audience, so I can do this. I mean, what are the defining features of different eras of human history, right? So you've got feudalism, right? You've got slavery, obviously, which is premised on ownership of human bodies. You've got communism, you've got capitalism. In all of these systems, they're premised on a certain type of ownership, right? Feudalism, the lord owns the labor. There's a labor responsibility. Communism, there is no private property. In capitalism, we own and can trade everything. My favorite part of this is you go back to the creation myths of Western civilization. They don't make sense unless you understand ownership. So Greek mythology, right? What's the spark of human civilization? Is Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, right? What is the start of human history in the Bible? It's Adam and Eve taking the fruit from the forbidden tree, right? God basically says, here's the Garden of Eden, make yourself at home. You see that tree? It's mine, don't touch it, right? And they take it, and then they become trespassers. I mean, quite literally, the creation myths of sort of Greek mythology and Judeo-Christian mythology, they don't make sense unless you understand the basic ideas of ownership.
And you read this book and you begin to see it everywhere. I was just reading Tom Stoppard's latest play, and literally it starts with a scene of a family dressing a Christmas tree. And literally the first line of it is one of the kids saying to the other, "That's mine." This is fascinating to me because for the longest time, I used to think that the fundamental root of all evil in modern life was incuriosity, but I've changed my mind. Recently, especially thanks to current affairs, I've decided that the root of all evil is absolutism. And which is why your last chapter, maybe penultimate chapter, is fascinating to me. Could you help us understand the idea of the dimmer, which is the antithesis of absolutism?
Right, so Michael's really better on this than I am. Is basically getting at this notion of whether we should think of property as absolute on-off or as a dimmer. Michael, let me pass it to you.
Well, I want to answer that. Actually, I just noticed that Madeline had a question about the South Dakota. I don't know if you want to hold questions till the end.
Let's hold to the end.
Or wrap it up. David, what's your preference?
We'll give it, depending on how many questions pile up, I would say, no later than quarter after we would. Okay. So
actually, but that is actually a useful point for all of you who are listening. We're going to open it up for Q&A at some point, and you should be starting to put your questions in the chat, and David will start to field them a little bit later on. So one of the ways that we think about ownership, and it goes back to this instinctive, territorial, very primitive notion that we have about what's mine and what's not mine, is that we frame it in exactly that way. So when you go into a parking lot, there's a car that's mine. And for all the other cars, all I need to know about them is they are not mine. So that notion of mine and not mine, we think of as like a light switch. Either it's on and it's mine, or it's not on and it's not mine. And that is sort of a rough and ready rule, just like, first come, first serve, and possession is 9/10 of the law. All those understandings that we have are how we get through our day. But the problem with thinking about ownership, sort of having the metaphor of mine and not mine, is that it is way too rigid in a world where we're trying to achieve conflicting goals at the same time. And what mine and not mine lets you do is achieve one goal or the other, but not achieve sort of a more subtle, reflective understanding of what property, what ownership can do to achieve competing political and policy goals that we all have. So I don't know if David wants to get into this separately, but so one example might be ownership of our body parts. So one of our most basic sayings about ourselves is our body is ourselves, self-ownership. It's like the original sin of American ownership was the ownership of other people's bodies, of African-American bodies by white people. So when we think about self-ownership, we think in this very on-off switch way. It's mine or it's not mine. But today with medical advances, it's now possible to have many, many resources where a lot of lives could be saved if there were ways to both protect our core essential human dignity and equality and not being coerced, if we can make sure that that is true, but also if it were possible to have some of those bodily resources out on the market to save lives. Thousands of people die every year waiting for kidney transplants. Hundreds of thousands and more are stuck on dialysis, which is painful and costly and can be debilitating for people. But we banned the sale of kidneys. And maybe that's the right thing. Maybe the on-off switch metaphor is the right one there. But if you think of ownership as a dimmer, where we set it at the right level to address our genuine, deep concerns about dignity and humanity, and you also set the dimmer at the right place to address, like, what's the trade-off between people dying waiting for kidneys, and is there a way to create a market that would be safe and decent? Maybe the answer is no for that particular one. But the more general point is, once you start to think of ownership as a dimmer, it becomes possible to address a lot of dilemmas in everyday life that seem otherwise to be completely intractable because all you have is two choices, on or off.
Since we're talking about medicine, I wondered who owns these vaccines? Do they belong?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So the vaccine question, we know who owns the vaccines, right? The government has got the store piles and they're basically giving out to the states. The vaccine question really is what are we going to do about first come, first served, right? It's line standing. And one of the things that I love about this book is I also sort of think about these things differently as well. So are we going to do first come, first served? No, right? So right now with the COVID vaccine, everyone's in agreement that frontline health workers should be at the front of the line. But after that, it's just a complete mess. Who should come next? Should it be elderly? Should it be comorbidities? Should it be smokers? Should people be able to buy their way to the front? And the way I like to think about this is basically to think about, well, what do we know about line standing more generally? So let's take just, sort of one example, and that is the HOV lane, right? So traditionally getting to the fast lane is first come, first served. But it turns out around cities for the last 10, 15 years, that's changed. During rush hour, to get into the fast lane called the HOV lane, high occupancy vehicle, you either have to be carpooling or drive an electric vehicle or something. In most of these cities, that's improving the air quality, right? So the highway departments say, we're not going to do first come, first served. We are going to create an incentive. We're going to encourage people. We're going to use ownership basically as a remote control to encourage more carpooling, more purchaser use of these electric cars because we want to reduce air pollution. The problem I think we have right now with the COVID vaccine is those who own the vaccine, each state, they're not being clear what values they're trying to maximize, right? And the reason it's a mess is you have all these different interest groups saying, put me first, I'm deserving for these various reasons. And the state essentially is being pretty passive. And if the state, I think, made the hard decisions and was transparent about it, saying we want to reduce risk to individuals, that's our goal. If that's your goal, then it's actually pretty easy to find who gets to the front of the line. They're not doing that because they're trying to just, please a lot of people, which ends up being kind of a mess.
Are you guys sick yet of everybody asking you who owns this, who owns that? Because you better get used to it. Is that?
This is what we love this stuff. Jim and I both have been teaching for 25 years and we've taught thousands of students, and I still wake up and I love going into work. I love teaching. I don't understand. Like, I have colleagues who teach about constitutional law. I never understand what I never know what they're talking about. I can't read a constitutional law case. My mind starts to hurt. But if it's something tangible and physical, like, can you pick the avocado or lemon that's hanging over the street from the neighbor's house? I get that. That's for me where the real like, that's it. I
Yeah,
love
David,
this stuff.
also, yeah, David, let me turn it back on you, because I think that you and every person listening to this podcast throughout the day is asking, who owns, is it mine? Who owns what? You know, it's like we're fish swimming in water and don't realize it. We are making, I mean, literally ownership decisions all the time, right? You know, there's a resource out there. Can I take that shopping cart? Where's my place in line? All these things, their ownership. We don't think about it that way, but that's really what they are, and they're ingrained.
Okay, then I will ask you some more who owns it questions. Who owns journalism? There's a lawsuit going on, or a proposed legislation in Australia right now about whether Google should compensate news organizations for all of the news that they link to, or should the money go to some other party rather than depriving Mark Zuckerberg of money in order to enrich Rupert Murdoch? Should money be given to help small town journalism in news deserts? What would be a smart way to think about that question?
Michael, any thoughts on that?
Sure. One of the things that we've seen in this country, this is again, I'm going to come at this a little bit from the side and then circle into the ownership point, is we've seen, if you think about newspapers when we were growing up, what paid for journalism wasn't journalism. What paid for journalism was classified ads. Like, classified ads basically supported all the investigative journalists that we all know. Like, that was the back pages that supported the front pages. And that was true for every newspaper. And when Craigslist basically killed that 20 years ago, it destroyed the business model that had worked for generations for newspapers. So one of the challenges for us as a free society is, how do we get the information that we need to actually be responsible citizens? So that information came to us. Like, what produced the information that made us able to deliberate as citizens was classified advertising. Like, you don't think of it that way, but that transmission belt was a pretty tight one. So the challenge today is, how do we think about that function? I don't care if particular newspapers survive or not. That's tough. But what I do care, I do. But newspapers come and go. There's a lot of newspapers in the 20s and 30s, 100 years ago, that don't exist today. There was a whole, Yiddish press that came and went. There was a whole African-American press that came and went. There were a lot of aspects of American media that have changed radically over the centuries. But one piece that is constant is that we do want there to be a vibrant press. And that is a function that I think provides a social good in our society. So the challenge is, how do you provide a social good in a time when the market mechanism that had previously provided that good, which was classified advertising, has disappeared? So we are seeing some shift to new mechanisms for providing that social good. So we see entities like ProPublica, where very rich people decide it's in their interest to fund investigative journalism that might even go and bite them. That's one version. Second version is paywalls. So you are starting to see some stabilization of elite media where they can survive through paywalls. So the New York Times and Wall Street Journal survive. But what you aren't really seeing is a lot of local news existing as an independent entity. So that's an area where I do worry about how the new ownership terrain is really causing a real desert, a news desert in places where it really matters, which is holding local officials accountable. So proposals like the Australia proposal, what's happening in Australia is they're basically saying to the Facebooks and Googles, you can't use for free. You can't simply reprint news without paying for it, which is how it works in the United States. Now, when you go on Google and you search for the article about our book in the New Yorker yesterday, it's going to come up for free. You'll just type it into Google and it'll say, Elizabeth Colbert, boom, Heller, Salzman, and there it'll be. And that's great for us, but it's not so good for the New Yorker. So how do we protect that? So, and the answer, I guess, to sort of close the loop and sort of close this off is, there is no correct answer. What there is your earlier question, is this about politics? And the answer is 100% yes. And what you need is countervailing powers to, like, Facebook and Google are more powerful than many governments. So in some ways, and you need governments standing up to them and trying to reach an appropriate balance that which does the job of a government, which is to ensure that public goods that ensure the common welfare get provided. So if the mechanism in Australia is we're going to make you pay, pay for a newspaper that you use, I think there's a perfectly reasonable version of the ordinary back and forth through which ownership claims are established. This isn't kids arguing in a playground. It's the same 6 stories that we're talking about, but it's happening at $1 billion level, not at a toy shovel level. And what that means for us going forward is that, I think actually for the Facebooks and the Googles, ultimately, whenever there's any new resource, news is free on the internet, the Facebooks and Googles are going to claim it. That's the standard way. 23andMe claims your genome when you swab. They take that. Facebook and Google claim your clickstream, your likes and looks as you move around the internet. They claim that. So whenever there's any new resource that's valuable, people are going to run in and claim it. But that doesn't mean we have to accept that story. They're making one ownership story. They're saying the data is attached to our app and it's ours for that reason. And we could say, no, it's attached to our bodies, or we had it first. We have other ownership stories. And that's part of our job as citizens, is to push back against claims from big tech that say, that seem very natural that they should own it.
This is fascinating. I could talk about the press all day, but let's talk about something a little bit more universal. We're here thanks to the good graces of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. How do these considerations factor into the way we think about the environment?
Yeah, so ironically, one of the reasons that we have so many environmental problems is there's not enough ownership. All right, so think, for example, of someone who owns a wetland. Right, so the wetland provides a lot of benefits, right? It provides habitat for fish and for wildlife. It filters water, so you get cleaner water coming through it. If there's a storm or a flood, it basically acts as a buffer to protect the downstream community. None of that can be owned by the landowner, by the landholder. And so as a result, if you look at the real estate value, the market value of the wetland, it's basically premised on, can you build there or not, right? And so don't be surprised if the people who own these lands provide a whole stream of what are called ecosystem services, nature services, they don't manage the land to provide those services. They're very real, right? And so some of the most innovative and forward-looking environmental instruments basically are premised on ownership. So take New York City, right? I grew up in Boston. I can't stand, except for Michael, I can't stand things from New York. They're bragging, saying we're wonderful this, wonderful that, Broadway, yeah. One of the things they say is we have the world's best drinking water. And in fact, they probably do. Now, the reason for that is that the water doesn't come from New York, right? It comes from about 100 miles away in the Catskills in Delaware. And it's been like that for over a century. The problem, though, was in the 1980s, 1990s, the water quality was going down. And New York City faced this choice. Do we basically invest in this multi-billion-dollar treatment plant, or instead, do we invest in the natural infrastructure? So what they did is they basically said to the landowners, we're going to use what Michael and I call as-if ownership. It's basically the principle of attachment. And we're going to treat you as if you own all those benefits you provide us, primarily clean water. And so if you can manage your land to ensure the water coming off the land is good for drinking, we'll pay you for that. And that turns out to be, it's a little more complicated than that, but that's the basic idea. And it's the same notion that we can use with climate change and with fisheries as well. I mean, this is a controversial thing for me to say to many of my environmental colleagues, but I think one of the problems, one of the challenges of environmental protection is we don't have enough ownership. I think we need more things to be owned, not less.
So the amazing thing in New York City was, this is all just one guy, a guy named Al Appleton, who was a city employee. And he was, and New York City it's the largest municipal water supply that's untreated. There's a little bit of chlorine, but basically it goes straight from the mountains right into that's the water I'm drinking. I can't show it with the background, but anyways, this water comes untreated from the Catskills. And Al Appleton basically said, okay, let's use the attachment principle, as Jim just said. We're going to attach those services to owners' land, and not to profit, but to clean up the environment. And he invested in trees instead of concrete, and green rather than gray infrastructure. And it's one of the great sort of unsung stories of environmental protection. Now, and this story actually goes much deeper. It's also the most powerful tools we have for protecting fisheries, for protecting against climate change. Actually, this is an area that Jim really focuses on quite a bit. Jim, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Let me see if David wants to move us elsewhere.
Oh, I'm just along for the ride. Since you mentioned Al Appleton, I mean, your book is full of a lot of creeps, frankly. There's guys who shoot drones over other people's houses, and the people who own the houses, you know, bring them down with a shotgun. But are there people like Al Appleton whose thinking and works in this area are really rather heroic?
Yeah, so I mean, let me tell the fishery story. So you're all familiar with the reality TV show, The Deadliest Catch. And the basic idea is this basically is a show that covers these king crab fishing vessels that go out of these ports in Alaska. They go into the Bering Sea. And it really was the deadliest catch. When the show started in the early 2000s, it was more dangerous to be on a fishing vessel in that fishery than to be on foot patrol in Iraq. Right? People died. Why did they die? Well, the fishery was premised on a first come, first served idea. They basically had a season quota, and when the season started, boom, all the boats went out fishing and tried to catch the crabs as quickly as possible. And if the weather was bad, you know, if you stayed in port to be safe, you are a sucker, because the other boats are out there catching the crab. And when the season ends and you're still in port, too bad. Very dangerous, right? It was sort of Mad Max on the high seas. And so what happened was that, you know, you're talking about the Al Appleton types, Iceland, of all places, came up with this innovation. It's become known as catch shares. And they basically, again, use this principle of attachment. And they said, we are going to treat that entire season's catch as a piece of property that can be owned up front. And they basically split it up into all these different things called catch shares or individual transferable quotas. And so for argument's sake, and they're allocated beforehand, so you might have an allowance that says you get 1 ton of king crab this season. And so in practice, what it means is that if the weather's bad, you stay in. If the price of the crab is low, you stay in. And this has been adopted around fisheries all over the world. And the funny thing is that the deadliest catch now is really hard to edit because it's just not that deadly, right? You're not going to have a show that's called the Not So Deadly Catch, right?
That's so Solomonic. And you guys are, as far as I'm concerned, the Solomons of all these questions. Do you consult on the side? Do people come to you, or are they now starting to come to you and say, you know, help keep us from killing each other? What do we do?
So I'm actually right now literally working on 2 projects, one with the World Bank, one with the Asian Development Bank, and I'm working in Vietnam and in China. And they are basically writing these laws, what's called payments for ecosystem services, but it's the Catskill story, right? How do we direct funds to landowners so they're encouraged to provide the public goods, the benefits that we all profit from? This really is the cutting edge right now of environmental law around the globe. And it's all premised on ownership. I'm
going to take a liberty here and start interspersing the audience's questions with my own, not because I'm not full of them, but it's probably easier than me, you know, trying to make sense of a dozen questions in a row at the stroke of 1:15. And luckily I see a question from a friend of mine, so he gets to go first. Jim Potter, who works for CEQA, says, as a mode of thinking, why is an ownership analysis preferable to a rights analysis? For example, I ask whether I have the right to trim a tree limb that extends from my neighbor's yard onto my yard. I don't ask whether my neighbor owns that limb.
Michael, you're muted.
So here's where this is why I love this stuff. Like, so Jim's question is it sounds like a lawyer's question. Is Jim a lawyer? Or I don't know.
Yep.
Maybe not. So my mind doesn't work that way. Like, I don't distinguish between thinking about things in terms of rights or things in terms of ownership. I don't know, for me at least, it's the same question. Like, can I pick the goddamn lemon or not? And for me, you know, I understand how you can, as a lawyer, you can think about sort of a rights analysis. Rights are often trumps. If something is a right, then it's something. We say this is my First Amendment right, or my this or that right. Then one consequence of that in sort of political discourse is that if it's a right, it's sort of like the on-off switch. it trumps any other competing concerns. I don't think of that, and I don't think of like for the lemon, is there a right? I think like, what are the competing concerns about the lemon? And if I frame it in terms of rights, that's one. If I want to have a strong outcome, that's one way. Then I say, yeah, I have a right, because I want to use the rhetorical power of rights language. But I don't actually believe that myself.
Another way to think about it, though, using the sort of framework that we've got, is you've got two competing stories, right? So one story is my home is my castle, right? That lemon is in the column above the land that I own that goes from hell all the way up to heaven. And this has been a basic principle, since Roman times and before. So of course I can pluck the lemon. On the other side, you've got this notion of attachment, which Michael talked about, goes all the way back to the Code of Hammurabi. The lemon is attached to something I own. The tree grows initially on my property. And so of course that lemon on your property also belongs to me, right? And so a rights-based analysis doesn't help with that, right? So you've got two rights. The question is which story is going to be more persuasive, and why should we, more importantly, why should we favor one story over another?
And that's really the way I think Jim and I think about this. We think about ownership very much as a storytelling battle. And what we want is for you to realize that these are just stories. They can be more or less persuasive. If it's like super powerful and super persuasive, maybe I'll call it a right because I want to win. But basically what we have is more or less persuasive stories around the stuff that we all want. So whether it's attachment or possession for that lemon, it's, you have to argue about it. And there isn't a correct answer. There isn't a natural answer to whose lemon it is. It's, it's whoever tells the better, it's whoever tells the better story plus power. Like, it matters who decides.
Yeah, that's right. So who's deciding among the stories obviously matters enormously. But one of the real insights that came to me from writing this book is let's sort of, talk about something that we all have seen before, particularly those of us who have kids. And that is at the playground. These two kids are fighting over a plastic shovel. And what we hear is mine, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine. It's like that scene with the seagulls or the pelicans and Finding Nemo, right? It's mine, 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 mine. I guess they're seagulls. That's not what's really happening. What's really happening is battling stories. One child is saying, first possession, I have the shovel first. The other is saying a current possession, I'm holding it now, right? Imagine the kid put the shovel down, turned around, another kid picked it up. The point is that storytelling battle is the exact kind of thing happening all around us in much bigger issues, right? So Michael was talking, who owns your click stream? Those are competing stories, right? The web, to put it in the story context, the web behemoths are saying your click stream, your looks and your likes that we're going to sell, those are attached to our website. They're ours. But there's a response. The response is saying, no, self-ownership. That click stream, that's part of me. You can't take it. And what's fascinating is that in most jurisdictions right now, that's up for grabs. Right? There's a debate going on right now who should own your click stream, and there's no single right answer.
I like Eleanor. I'm just gonna jump in. I just love Eleanor's comment a second ago. Telling stories strategically to those in power. Isn't that being a lawyer? And Eleanor, that's exactly right. I mean, that really is what a lot of how I think about how I teach my students is a lot of what it means to be a lawyer in our culture. A lot of the power that lawyers have is the power of rhetoric. Is the power to be able to tell stories that are persuasive in front of the audiences that they're trying to persuade. There's certain kinds of arguments that count for a judge, others for the media, others if you're in front of your church and you want to do this versus that, others as a parent. But that's very much what it means to be that's the power that lawyers have is a storytelling power, and it shouldn't be reserved to lawyers. I mean that's part of the book. That's why this book is written not for lawyers.
Right. The one thing I would add to that is it's not just the ability to tell stories. I think equally, and the reason that we wrote this book in large part is the ability to spot stories and to identify what are the stories that are being told. And is that the only story that's possible? And the answer always is no. There's always another story.
Mike, you remind me of something, which is that I don't have the soul power to look at questions in the chat room. You both do too. So if you guys spot a question that you'd like to answer, you're welcome to jump on it after I ask this question, which is, I want to talk about copyright. which gets me where I live, having had to pay on occasion to retrieve stories that I've written for the San Francisco Chronicle or the Los Angeles Times, and having discovered that the aforementioned Dear Los Angeles is available for free on the Internet Archive. Although I'm fond of the Internet Archive, so it's hard to begrudge them that. Where does copyright fit into all of this?
Well, I have a strong view on this, which may not be yours, but let me sort of put it forward. I think that we tend to have too much ownership in our society. I think that it's very costly for us as a culture to have as much copyright protection and also as much patent protection as we do. I think this is an area very much where ownership is overrated. And I mean this actually in a legal sense rather than sort of the storytelling sense. I think that having legal ownership over ideas and culture is really can be devastating for culture itself. The background norm in America is that you can copy for free. That's the basic rule. You can copy for free. Things like copyright and patent, those are legislative or statutory exceptions to the background norm. The reason we have copying is free as the background norm is that copying is how we innovate. We build on top of things that have come before. Like every story traces back, and you guys are in LA, it all traces back to, Shakespeare stories, right? It's only a handful of stories that are the archetypes for everything. So, we need to be able to copy in order to be able to have culture. Culture is interdependence and copying. One of the sort of, I think, mistakes in American law in the last century, not the last century, basically in the last 50 years, is actually speaks to the PowerPoint we were talking about a little bit before, is the US copyright law basically caving to the interests of the Disney Corporation. So Disney, whenever Mickey Mouse copyright was about to expire, this was true 40 years ago, and it was true 20 years ago, Disney went to Congress and said, give us 20 more years of copyright protection for this already existing innovation. Mickey Mouse is the most profitable, most valuable fictional character alive. Mickey Mouse earns several $billions a year for the Disney company. And they gave a small percent, 1 or 2% of that, to basically pay enough senators and congressmen to buy a 20 more year extension for copyright. And they did that in the 1970s, and then they did it again in the 1990s. And what that's meant is that today, copyright extends for the author's life. And I want David to live long and prosper and have a good long run with his copyrights. But it extends for a century now after all of our lives as authors. And that extension for 40 years that Disney bought doesn't add a single new song, a single new poem. It adds nothing to the store of knowledge, the innovation that copyright is meant to generate. What it did do that is so costly is that it meant that American culture from the 1920s up until the 1960s, one of the great moments in world history of sort of cultural explosion, all that culture is still locked away under copyright. Almost 99% of it is not available. Some 1% is in print, but the other great material from back then is not available. And this part of why it's not available is that copyright ownership splinters from generation to generation. It's impossible to actually even define the people who own those copyrighted works. Short story writers simply disappear because there's no way to reprint those books anymore. Poetry compilations simply disappear. A lot of the great films and the choreography and painting, a lot of the culture that America produced, there's actually more culture from the 1800s available today in America now, because it's in the public domain, than there is from the 1920s to 1960s. And that was all simply to benefit Mickey Mouse. So my argument would be less copyright is actually more creative is better, not none. We need to be able to make a living as a reporter, but not 100 years either.
But Dave, this also plays into something that's literally in the front pages right now, which is Dr. Seuss, right? Dr. Seuss didn't decide to take those six copies out of circulation. It's his estate. And, building off what Michael said, why does his estate own his goods, right? Is it likely that he would have written more or less if he had not known that he could leave, his works to his estate? There's a very real question about that. And the sort of most extreme version of this is the Martin Luther King's estate, who you may have heard really zealously guard any use of his iconic speeches. And so in the great film Selma, it sounds like Martin Luther King giving this wonderful oratory. It's not his words. his words had already been licensed to Steven Spielberg for a different film. And so, one of the questions that builds off what Michael was talking about, and it's why I said in the beginning, we sometimes think too much of ownership and too little. And I think in this case, this is where we think too much of ownership. There are very real questions to ask whether we're better off as a society to actually give less protection.
There's actually a phenomenon I discovered about 25 years ago that I called ownership gridlock. And it was actually the subject of 2 or 3 books ago. I wrote a book called The Gridlock Economy. And in that book, I argued and showed that how too much ownership actually costs lives, wrecks our culture, is actually quite harmful to our society by comparison with sort of the right amount. And I argue that we have way too much ownership in the patent law, that most innovation today, it used to be the case 100 years ago, that you had one patent and that generated one product. You had a patent on a mousetrap and you sold a mousetrap. But today, almost all innovation is cumulative. Almost all inventions today require dozens or hundreds, or in some cases thousands, or for the ATM technology, hundreds of thousands of separate patents. And if each patent holder has a monopoly, which is what a patent is, that means the sum of all those patents can block the cumulative innovation that is actually where the cutting edge of the economy is today. So too much innovation, too much patent, too much protection in patents has meant too little innovation. This has been really most devastating in the drug development area. A lot of drugs that could come to market haven't come to market because of ownership gridlock in the patent area. And it is also what explains why, it's also the sort of driving force for why I think there's too much ownership in the copyright area, because so much of culture is accumulating pieces, putting together bits of culture to make some new thing, mashups and compilations, and rap that goes over a series of samples, documentaries that require access to lots of archive material. And if it's too easy to block each piece, if each piece is a separate monopoly, it really changes, limits, shrinks the range of creativity that's possible for us as a culture. And conversely, we have some of the most creative, powerful, super innovative parts of our economy all operate without ownership. Like fashion industry has new stuff, like Zara and Forever 21, they're like bringing in new stuff all day long. They're constantly innovating. They're knocking off expensive stuff. And there's no protection in fashion for design. Comedians are telling new jokes. Coaches are coming up with new sports plays. There is a whole world of innovation that happens outside of ownership. Jim and I had an article in Harvard Business Review a few days ago. They put the title on. The title was Elon Musk doesn't care about patents. Why should you? And that's actually was a quote from our story, which is that Elon Musk has no patents on SpaceX. He keeps a secret because for him, patents don't actually add anything. He's a patent skeptic. He's built his company in a patent-free zone. And it turns out that in an area after area of the most high-tech leading pieces of our economy, they do it without legal ownership. They use substitutes to ownership, like being first, like being secret. They're like using social media shaming. There are alternative measures of control that are actually not as rigid as law. So I'm very much a skeptic about law. I mean, there's one more point that Jim can jump in. The last argument I was making about fashion and jokes and comedians, there's a great book by a UCLA colleague of Jim's, Cal Rastiala, who wrote a book called The Knockoff Economy, where in that book he develops exactly this argument about the innovative power of no ownership at the cutting edge of the American economy.
So I wanted to touch on one of the questions that's come up a few times in the chat, and it's something called the commons. Because when Michael and I, we're doing a lot of speaking about this right now, and one of the comments we often get is, what about cultures where there doesn't seem to be a lot of private ownership? There's more communal ownership. How do we think about that? And the sixth story that we have in the book is it's mine because I'm in the family, and that basically is trying to get at a number of things. One of them is that a lot of value transfer happens during the family moments, birth, divorce, marriage, death. that's part of the South Dakota story. But the second thing is we can different cultures think differently about this sort of the family community ownership idea, right? So in many cultures, including ours, we can have land and such that is held in common, right? We can all access it, right? This would be, for instance, the deep sea, right? Legally, if you go more than 200 miles off the coast, it's sort of everyone's stuff. There's literally speaking, no ownership there. The point I would make, though, is that oftentimes people say, well, if you've got a communal society, does that mean ownership stories don't matter? And the answer is yes, because even if there's a lot of things that are held in common, there are always going to be resources that are scarce, that people want. And so even in those communities, I mean, neither of us are anthropologists, but our argument is that these 6 stories are going to be in play everywhere, no matter whether it's more of a communal-based society or more of a private property-based society.
And we have a big public domain. So there's a public domain in the commons. You can sort of think of that as the ocean or the air that we breathe. But there's also the public domain for IP. So when things fall out of patent or fall out of copyright, they become part of the public domain. It's just as much an ocean of ideas as there is an ocean of water. And those are still subject to the possibility of tragedy, of overuse. It's not true in the IP area. When the crucial difference between intellectual property and real stuff is that once the idea exists, everybody can use it. Once there's an apple recipe, we can all make baked apple pie, and the apple recipe is available for the millionth person. So from the public domain of ideas, we really want that to be very wide. Public domain of in the commons and real stuff, the resources are actually scarce. We have a rivalry, and that rivalry can lead to dramatic overuse. So even in a physical commons, it may be that there's a community, but the way that communities police against overuse may not be through law, but it is through shaming. It is through negative, truthful gossip. Like, boy, he took too much stuff out of our community garden. So we still have very powerful rules of ownership. They just operate through these non-legal mechanisms like shaming.
You make me think about literary criticism in a new way. I mean, I always pay attention to Public Domain Day, which this year, for example, made The Great Gatsby anybody's pigeon. And I'm thinking of all the stuff that, we don't have to look for the next Fitzgerald. We just have to go back and look for the Fitzgerald that we're not allowed to get our hands on at the moment, or we haven't heard enough about. Because
and there were 40 more years of stuff, stuff from 1921 to 1961. All of that would be available to all of us to reclaim, except for Mickey Mouse.
Yeah, what little, if anything, entitles me to be moderating this conversation is that I read a book by a guy named Lawrence Lessig years ago, who's a lawyer who knows a lot about Mickey Mouse and almost but not quite won a Supreme Court case about this. I wrote a book review for the San Francisco Chronicle, which I have to pay $1.99 to read, about that book. And I think I got off a pun in the last line using the Latin cui bono, because Sonny Bono was the guy who actually shepherded the legislation. Okay, I've got another friend in the chat room to whom I'm going to give preference. Melanie Winter, who's done so much over the years to preserve the Los Angeles River, asks where the public trust enters into this whole conversation.
So the public trust is I'm sorry, Jim, you should take this one.
Yeah, so the public trust is a doctrine that's been around since Roman times and arguably earlier than that. Essentially, the public trust is a limit on what owners can do. It basically says to the government, you have an obligation to ensure that there is access to waterways for, it depends on where you are, but for shellfishing, for commerce on the rivers and such. It became famous in California in the Mono Lake case, where basically the state was told by the Supreme Court, you have an obligation to ensure that the runoff going down from the Sierras reaches and restores the ecology of Mono Lake. And so I think of the public, and Michael may have a different take on this, I think of the public trust doctrine not as a basis for ownership, but on a restriction on what owners actually can do. And it's playing out right now. Some of you may have heard of the Juliana case, Ann Carlson, a colleague of ours at UCLA, who's now in the Biden administration, has worked a lot on this. The argument basically is that there is a public trust to the atmosphere, and the government has an obligation to ensure climate stability through what goes into the atmosphere. Michael, you have a different take on it?
I don't. I'm just noticing that there are some questions. I have to leave in 9 minutes, so I don't know how we want to. Do we want to do a sort of a lightning round of questions, or should we? Yeah. How do you want to do it, David?
And actually, David, before we do that, I do want to do the big book pitch because folks may have to drop off. Here it is.
Oop, it's hard to see.
There it is.
That one's
so like we're at a very delicate time in launching a book. It's super hard to launch a book during COVID. And it's a challenge. And so, we'd love for you to buy the book. That's great. Please do. It's a super fun read. It's actually, we wrote it like for people who like books like Freakonomics and Nudge. And it's an airport book. It's easy to read. It's fun. But it's a great gift. It's a great summer read. All that's true. But that's not what I'm asking for. I mean, what we actually really want, we hope for audiences now is like, if you have another audience that you think, hey, I have 100 or 500 or 1,000 people that this is really useful for, let us know. Like we love talking about this stuff, and we're available to come give talks. So let us know if you have an audience that would like to hear it. And then also, we have all our social media channels. I don't know how many of you use social media. We're not big users ourselves, but we have been for the book, and we really are trying to figure out how do we amplify this message. And we really do want your help for that. So please, I hate to ask, but we really do want and need your help.
As far as I'm concerned, one Colbert down and one to go. You've got Elizabeth, now you need Stephen.
From your lips to God's ears. Like, if anybody has a connection, we actually love to do more TV on this. Like that, if you have connections in that world that I think would be interested, please don't be shy. I'm not being shy in asking, so please let us know.
Well, I've got 2 more questions in my back pocket, but I'm going to ask you guys if you're seeing anything in the chat room you would love to weigh in on.
My sense is I'm happy to have Jim do it differently. I was just going to go through and do yes, no. I want everyone to have at least some response to what they asked. Is that reasonable?
Let's do it.
A quick sort of lightning round. Jim, what do you think?
We'll see. I'm not sure.
So let's go. So
they're yes, no answers.
But they're all fast. I mean, Madeline asks, has the federal government that loses revenue taken an interest? And the answer is yes, but it takes the federal government to override state law in this area, and they haven't chosen to do so. It's actually something that Jim and I are pushing in op-eds that we're writing. Is to actually push for a federal wealth transmission tax. Prudhomme said property is theft, yeah, but that's not enough. Like that doesn't get you very far. Like you need to have the next step, and then the next step is the 6 stories. Jim, I'm just gonna talk.
Yeah, Michael, actually, let me. I'm not sure that's fast.
Okay,
let me turn to the last question that we always turn to, which is sort of where is ownership going? All right, what are sort of the things we sort of see going? So I've got sort of one take. I think Michael has another. So for me, I think what's interesting is that we're changed in nature of how of the things that we own. We're moving more and more from sort of horseshoes and shovels and things that are sort of tangible to owning ones and zeros. And that has an enormous implication for the way we can own things and how much we own. So when you buy, it says they click the buy now button on Amazon, studies show that 85–90% of people assume they just bought an ebook is the same thing as a real book. And it's not. It's not. Amazon can take it back. They have taken it back. You can't cut it up. You can't share it with people. Look at this phone, right? Actually, you can't look at the phone, but imagine you could, there we go. So this phone, so what do I own? I own this sort of shell that's the phone, but I don't own the operating system. I'm not allowed by my license to hack it. And the point I would make sort of on the future of ownership in the digital world is more and more we're moving to the situation where you bought it, but you don't own it. And there's a real growing mismatch, which is being taken advantage of, I think, to a large extent by these sort of online service providers. Michael, where would you go with the future of ownership?
Well, I mean, here's maybe I may be old, and this is sort of a retro position, but for me, I don't know that I want to live in a world where I stream everything and own nothing. People sometimes say that the future of ownership is we're coming to the end of ownership. You just, you don't own a car, you just stream a car service. You don't cook, you just stream food services. And there's a lot of benefit to that. There's a lot that's good about that. But I don't want to live in a world. I don't think, like, I like to cook. So for me, like, I have old cookbooks, and this is actually, there's like stains on the pages. Like, it brings me back 30 years to when I was, cooking out of the silver palette cookbook. I actually love having those physical, tangible items in my life. It actually is meaningful to my identity, as is not a lot of stuff. I'm Marie Kondo the place like everyone else. I threw out a bunch of stuff, but Marie Kondo's point isn't throw out everything. Her point was throw out stuff that doesn't spark joy in your life. But there are stuff that really does spark joy and is very meaningful. I had a real connection to my first car. So I think that as we move to like this online world, I think we lose potentially some of the sort of tangible, I actually think of it as a spiritual connection with the stuff that sort of makes us who we are, that sort of is the place within which we have our families, our rituals, what really matters to us. And all of that happens. If you think, let me just think one digression for a second. If you could think about monks in a monastery, like the physical space was essential to the spiritual community that they created. Now, we're not monks and this isn't a monastery, but our stuff around us, our homes, has a real, I think, meaning to us that is potentially lost as we move online. Like, I don't want to live in a world where I lease my wedding ring and rent my dog. I don't see that as like a step in the right direction.
So David, let's give you the last word.
First of all, I apologize for enjoying this too much and not letting enough other people answer questions. Maybe you guys can see them in the chat room before they disappear and at your leisure answer any irresistible ones yourselves. First of two, I'm doing a lot of work lately to revive the Federal Writers Project, working with Congressman Ted Lieu and State Senator Ben Allen, who incidentally is the son of a UCLA English professor. And I was just going to ask you guys, is there any legislation right now or imminent that we can pester our elected representatives to pass that would reflect some of this very hard and smart thinking you guys are doing?
Yes, there's one bill right now that we didn't get to talk about today. The flip side of South Dakota, which largely basically protects untaxed income, which is one of the questions in the chat, is North Carolina, which is for African-American land ownership, it's dropped 98% in this country in the last 100 years for racist violence reasons, but also because of the extremely harsh operation of the form of ownership that we have for poor Black families, for community families of color. There was a bill introduced by Cory Booker in this session, co-sponsored by Elizabeth Warren, that's meant to respond precisely to the hidden ownership story that's led to this 98% drop in African-American land ownership. It's sort of targeted at what's called heirs property that's fractionated, that's gridlocked because of the way that property passes without wills. It's basically targeted at protecting the few remaining African-American farmers and providing a measure of reparations for those who've lost their farms. I think that's a very important bill to be talking about.
David, you got 30 seconds.
One final question. You co-wrote it. Who owns it? Whose book is this?
That's the sequel, ours.
Perfect. All right.
And it belongs to all of us who are enjoying it so much. I encourage the rest of you to make good on your desires to make this book yours. Meantime, for me, for the Emmett Institute, and at least 75 grateful listeners, thank you very much. Let's see some yellow clapping symbols in the upper left-hand corner.
Thanks so much, David.
My pleasure. The rest of you, I'm assuming, just don't know how to do that, but you're clapping.
All right. Bye-bye.